Okay, I want to stick on the question of democracy, but bring it onto another issue, an issue that's close to your heart and my heart, which is the issue of climate change and environmentalism and the problems with the politics of environmentalism. Because one of the things that has struck me over the past week or so prior to recording this is the possibility that a lot of the things that people like us would have been concerned about in relation to the European Union, which is the use of mysteriously divined regulations to hamper what ordinary people consider to be the right course for the nation. I think some of that could well shift now from the European Union sphere onto the green sphere. So I'm thinking about the Court of Appeal striking down of expansion at Heathrow Airport. And I'm thinking about the way in which that has emboldened environmentalists, in fact. And we now have people like Hugh Fearnley-Whittenstall and George Monbiot who are openly arguing and agitating for the use of law to strike down pretty much any big infrastructure project. So I just wondered, what do you think is the possibility that anti-democratic methods will find their way into other areas of life which are incredibly important to the future prospects and jobs and livelihoods of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, well, we see. I mean, you mentioned the case of Heathrow, but I think in December, one of these green groups launched a court case to stop the building of a very, very large Drax gas-fired power station. And it was interesting because I think that there was some kind of document produced from government that said that this was not in accordance with the government's commitment to net zero. And the then business secretary, I think it was Leadsom, overruled it and said, no, we should go ahead with this very sensibly. And it is now in the courts. And, we're not now talking about Heathrow, because Heathrow still exists, and plenty of planes. We're talking about either this thing being or not being.
Yeah.
And of course, gas is the most wonderful thing, because I remember when I was young, you didn't have gas-fired power stations because it was defined as a premium fuel. So it was used for central heating. But the point was it was very scarce and it was called, very interesting, a premium fuel not to be used for power generation. Now, due to the sort of wonderful technological advances in drilling and geology and geological surveys, what we've discovered basically is, to all intents and purposes, is a limitless supply of gas in the world. Basically, it's in all sort of strata we never imagined. It's very cheap, it's very clean, and yet these people want to stop it because it isn't wind or solar.
Yeah.
And by the way, they also stop nuclear. So even if you take the argument, even if you say, we won't have gas, although I can't see on earth why not, but, this is kind of in defiance of the laws of maths and physics. I mean, you simply cannot have a functioning economy based entirely on renewables. And there was a very brilliant man called David Mackay, who was the government's, dead now, unfortunately, chief scientific advisor. And he wrote a book called Renewable Energy Without the Hot Air. And he said, if you want essentially a carbon-free industrial economy, you have to have massive investment in nuclear. And and by the way, he was convinced of the danger of global warming, climate change. He was completely sort of online with that. But he said, this is what you have. And yet, in the Climate Change Committee, this Lord Debon's outfit, there's no mention of nuclear power. It's just not mentioned.
Yeah.
It wasn't mentioned when the net zero thing went through Parliament. And of course, in Germany, Angela Merkel, because of what happened at Fukushima, she obviously thought there'd be a tsunami somewhere in the German plain and immediately scrapped the nuclear program. So they're now digging up lignite, which is the dirtiest form of coal that exists, open cast coal mining called lignite. And so there's a kind of willful ignorance on the part of, I think, all the politicians, bar a tiny handful maybe, where they simply won't confront the kind of the mathematical truth, how the laws of physics demand that we have, if they want net zero.
Yeah. By
the way, I mean, how do you build a nuclear power? I mean, that a lot of concrete there. I mean, but still, and so I think it is a kind of strange lunacy, and I sort of have more respect for Greta Thunberg than I do for any of the politicians.
Right.
Because I think she, at least, is logical. She basically says, this is all very bad. We have to do it now. And we have to live a completely different life, which is almost a pre-industrial life. By the way, I don't think she and her generation would enjoy it very much, but nonetheless, that's what she's saying. And a lot of her supporters are like that, what Boris Johnson called old crusties, in their hemp bivouacs, I think was his phrase. Quite good. And yet, I think our politicians are very, very dishonest because they try to pretend to us that we could have as prosperous lives as we currently do with what they call a, quote, green industrial revolution, which is in fact deindustrializing.
Yeah.
Which is in fact goes against what the Industrial Revolution was.
Yeah. It's
a form of impoverishment. And of course, if you are rich, you can afford maybe to pay an extra £20,000 on top of what you would normally pay for an electric car, i.e. it cost you that much more for a big electric car over the internal combustion engine equivalent. But no, not for most people. For most people, that is crucifying.
Yeah.
And I think that the public, I mean, the government, they will come up against it. They haven't yet, but at some point, and we saw it, by the way, in France with the Gilets jaunes, at some point, the government will suddenly come up against public revolt because the logic of their policies will be impoverishing for millions of people. I don't see how it couldn't be.
Yeah.
I mean, the figures are clear. If you have the kind of carbon tax that the International Monetary Fund IMF says is required to, I don't know how they work it out, but what they say is required to bring, if everyone did it across the world to check the rise in temperatures, you're talking about a doubling in household electricity prices. Yeah. Well, how do people do that? Professor Michael Kelly, who's Emeritus Professor of Engineering at Cambridge, says that if we were to convert our entire housing stock to make it essentially net zero, he estimates the cost to be about £4 trillion. Now, if you were to say to the British public, if we have £4 trillion to spend, how would you like it spent? That would not be how they would like it spent.
No.
Even if we had it, which we don't. So, yeah, I agree with you, Brendan. I think I think there will be a huge democratic crunch.
Yeah.
I don't know when, but there will be. But things like Heathrow, I don't think that would cause a problem. If anything, it's probably quite unpopular, certainly unpopular in London. I think if Drax can't build this gas-fired power station, okay, Drax will be annoyed. The people who might have worked there will be annoyed. But again, I don't see that. I don't think those will cause the crunches. And I don't think people are thinking about the courts particularly. I don't think that's where it will be. It will be at what I suppose you would call the retail end, when suddenly you're told, by the way, you've got this electric car. It's cost you an extra £15,000. You think, oh, that's great because I won't have to pay all that expensive diesel or petrol. But no, we're introducing road charging, of course, because we get 35 billion from duty on petrol and diesel. And now we're going to.
Yeah.
So you thought it was going to be free driving, but no, it'll cost you just as much. And by the way, you've had to pay for this.
Yeah.
And by the way, how is the electricity produced? Right? I mean, someone once said that they're called battery electric vehicles. And this chap, he was another professor of engineering actually at Imperial. And he said they should be called EEV, which is emissions elsewhere vehicles.
It will be very interesting to see where the breaking point comes. I mean, obviously in France, it was with the fuel tax, which then gave rise to a protest that lasted more than a year and which was incredibly conflictual at times and which very interestingly exploded so many other issues to do with country versus city, people versus the elites and so on. So, but I think that breaking point could come at there was a huge breaking point over EU membership or not EU membership. Yeah. And I think the green stuff lends itself to that too. But one thing that you've just following on from what you said there, you've written about the vanity and the hubris off some green policy. So you've pointed out in your pieces very sensibly, talking, others may defy maths and science, but you've talked about how the UK generates around 1% of global carbon emissions. Yep. So this desire for the UK to become carbon neutral, carbon zero and all that stuff, which is worryingly an idea shared by all parties, even if they disagree on the time frame, seems to me to be quite irrational, because the impact it will have on global carbon emissions and then global temperature is a different question as well. In addition to that, the impact it will have on global carbon emissions is very, very, very small. So what?
Yeah, not measurable.
Not measurable. So in the UK specifically, this kind of idea that we must be carbon neutral, we must cut it to zero, whether it's by 2030, 2050, 2070 or whatever. What drives that? Has it become just this kind of zealous crusade that is completely separated from any idea of facts and impact?
I mean, I genuinely understand where it comes from at the sort of dark green level, that it's Malthusian, that it's anti-human, that it sees man as a curse upon the planet. I understand that very well, and it has a kind of coherence to it. I genuinely am baffled by the political class, if you use that phrase. They're being swept up in this. It is a kind of moral vanity. I think it is the sense that when we walk on the world stage, we want to be seen as the good guys, that we want to be seen as the most enlightened, that we want to be seen as the most caring. And of course, it's very nice for them to go to these conferences and people to say, oh, you're doing a wonderful job. You know, of course, it doesn't mean anything to the people back home. I mean, and they don't go to these conferences anyway, and they don't get the nice hotel rooms and the champagne buffets and all that. But it's personally flattering. I think maybe also, I don't understand at all where it comes from the Conservatives. I think on the left, maybe because socialism or communism seem to have failed, that to have some kind of new moral cause, people who are on the left and probably find that psychologically highly necessary to feel that what they're engaged in is a moral cause,